Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into some incredibly fascinating source material that challenges something almost all of us just accept as absolute truth. We live in an era that is completely obsessed with gathering information. We consume books, podcasts, lectures, and infinite streams of data, totally convinced that acquiring more knowledge, even spiritual knowledge, is the ultimate path to personal growth. But we're going to explore some texts today that ask a pretty radical question. What if the exact opposite is true? What if the real path to growth isn't about learning more at all, but about profound, intentional unlearning? It's kind of a jarring thought, right? We generally treat our intellect as our absolute greatest tool for self-improvement. We constantly want to categorize the world, understand our exact place in it, and just feel completely secure in what we know. But the material we're looking at raises a vital question. What if our deep-seated need for certainty is literally the very thing keeping us stuck in our old patterns? Are we actually transforming, or are we just using knowledge to build a more sophisticated, spiritualized ego? To really wrap our heads around this paradigm shift, let's look at the revered Indian sage Ramana Maharshi. As the source material points out, Maharshi possessed an absolute certainty, but it was a certainty that completely dismantled mental concepts instead of building up rigid dogmas. He rarely gave formal speeches. He didn't build complex cosmologies or hand out strict moral rulebooks. His certainty was rooted in this quiet, undeniable experiential presence, not in intellectual claims.
Which brings us to Section 1, the suspicion of certainty. Now, notice the stark contrast when we break down this spectrum of certainty. On one side, we have what we're all pretty used to, dogmatic certainty. It relies heavily on rules, claims to answer every detailed question about the universe, and basically builds a massive ideology. But then look at the other side, Ramana's existential direct approach. It relies purely on direct awareness. When people came to him with super complex, speculative questions about the afterlife or the cosmos, he literally wouldn't answer them. Instead, he questioned the questioner. He intentionally stripped away their assumptions, completely refusing to feed the ego's insatiable desire for intellectual control.
So, how does this actually work in practice? Well, the texts outline what we can call the mechanics of mind softening. When Maharshi simply asked seekers, "Who am I?" he absolutely wasn't looking for a verbal philosophical answer. He intentionally induced a cognitive dead end. Think about it. By refusing to feed the mind new cosmic theories, he was literally starving the intellect. When you genuinely ask yourself, "Who am I?" and try to trace it back, you don't find a tangible object. You just hit a brick wall. This forces the busy mind into a highly receptive I don't know state. And that radical uncertainty? That is exactly where our rigid, habitual patterns finally start to lose their grip.
Moving right along to Section 2, intellect versus pure awareness.
The sources use this absolutely brilliant analogy to illustrate the core human error that Maharshi talked about. Think of pure awareness as the sun. It's self-luminous, it's an unbroken, infinite background presence that just simply is. The intellect, on the other hand, is like the moon. It's actually inert, it has zero light of its own, and it only appears bright because it's reflecting the sun's rays. The fundamental mistake we all make is that our intellect mistakes its borrowed light for its own independent existence. When we practice self-inquiry, we are essentially turning the mirror back toward the sun. We stop using the flashlight of the intellect to obsess over external objects, and instead, we trace that beam right back to the source, where the flashlight's beam becomes completely invisible in the blazing light of the sun. Which brings us to Section 3, the necessity of breakdown. So the crucial point here is that to actually experience that pure awareness, the rigid, comfortable structures of the intellect absolutely have to break down. And fair warning, according to the sources, this process is rarely a comfortable one. We can see the visceral psychological weight of this across different historical traditions. Take esoteric alchemy, for instance. Before you can create gold, you have to go through the Nigredo, or the blackening stage. This involves taking the prima materia, our raw, unrefined psyche that's just full of rigid identities, and reducing it into what is called the massa confusa. It's a chaotic, highly confused state that happens when your neat, organized mental structures dissolve into that I don't know space. You see, most spiritual approaches try to build a better ego prematurely, but alchemy recognizes that true transformation has to begin with the rotting away and putrefaction of the old self. The confusion isn't a mistake at all. It's literally the required first step.
And we see this exact same mechanic echoing perfectly in Christian mysticism too. The directive from Jesus to deny thyself and take up the cross acts as the ultimate friction against the ego's constant demand for safety, control, and intellectual certainty. It's not about some kind of passive suffering. It's the active acceptance of ego death.
It forces a very deliberate surrender of our personal agenda. The false self has to be completely undone before the authentic reality can reveal itself. It is an unselfing, not an upgrade. Let's move to Section 4, the subtractive path.
Seeing this incredible cross-cultural pattern, we can now look at how Eastern philosophies practically perfected this art of unlearning. The Taoist path explicitly frames growth as a subtractive process. The opening line of the Tao Te Ching famously warns that the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Basically, the exact moment your intellect attempts to name, define, or dogmatize reality, you are no longer dealing with reality. You're just dealing with your conceptual idea of it. So while intellectual pursuits are additive, you acquire facts every single day, the pursuit of the Tao requires dropping something every day. You purposefully deny your intellect's natural habit of categorizing and trying to control everything. Zen Buddhism takes this subtractive mechanic a massive step further, turning it into a total psychological pressure cooker. They use impossible koans, like what is the sound of one hand clapping, to intentionally drive the intellect into an absolute impasse. The student tries desperately to answer with logic and acquired knowledge, and the master just strikes down every single answer. This creates decay, or the great doubt. It intentionally induces a state of total intellectual gridlock. And when the conceptual mind exhausts all its logical energy and reaches its absolute limit, it suffers a sudden collapse. The intellect literally explodes from the inside, stripping away all that comfortable certainty to leave only bare, immediate experience.
That brings us to our final section, Part 5, Observing with Uncertainty. Knowing all of this, from Maharshi to alchemy to Zen, how can we practically apply this radical unlearning to our own modern daily practices? Because let's face it, we don't all have a Zen master standing by to strike down our answers. If you want to stop building a better spiritualized ego, the texts suggest shifting how we practice mindfulness using 3 precise steps of what they call proactive confusion. First is micro-deconstruction. Instead of labeling a feeling as, say, shoulder pain, zoom in so close that the label completely falls apart. Find the exact border of the sensation until it just dissolves into an ambiguous cloud of energy. Second, hunting the observer. Turn the lens 180 degrees. Ask yourself, what is watching the mind right now? The intellect is great at finding objects, but it hits a total blank wall when it tries to find the subject. Finally, dropping the temporal frame. Intentionally ignore all the narrative links of past memory and future anticipation. Treat the current moment as an isolated sensory event with absolutely no history whatsoever. When we compare these approaches, it reveals a complete paradigm shift in how we relate to our own minds. Traditional mindfulness often teaches us to observe with certainty. It builds this calm, solid observer that says, I am feeling anxiety. The intellect maps it out, files it away, and finds a lot of comfort in that sense of control. But observing with uncertainty shifts entirely to deconstructive inquiry. You might feel a pulse in your chest, but you suspend the label of anxiety. You just look into the raw sensation without running it through the filter of past memory. By doing this, you actually allow that solid witness to evaporate. You aren't standing outside the experience judging it anymore. You are dissolving right back into the raw, unmapped mystery of being. Ultimately, everything we've explored from these sources leaves us with a profound choice about our own deeply ingrained need for control. We can absolutely continue using our intellect to safely navigate our personal growth, constantly adding new concepts, new rules, and new definitions to our spiritual library in an attempt to just build a better map of reality. Or we can choose the terrifying, subtractive path of the Massa Confusa and the Great Doubt. We can embrace the absolute freedom of genuinely saying, I don't know, and finally begin to dismantle the mapmaker altogether. So what's going to be? Which path will you choose?